So now I just started recording. So should be just a few questions. Not well, just not a few. I have several of them, but um, the whole entire thing is that I'm going to be asking you some questions about Hurricane Helene and what really went down, and also the meteorological aspect of the entire thing. And before we get started, what is your background at the National Weather Service as well as meteorology as a whole?
Yeah, so I'm a meteorologist at the National Weather Service. Coming up 5 years next month, actually. And
Yeah.
then, graduated in 2019 at NC State and worked at AccuWeather for 8 months prior, after graduating. And then I got the job here at Greenville-Spartanburg.
Cool, yeah, because I do remember we were talking about this when I did that shadow shift. We were talking at the whole shift over in August, and you were talking about how you worked at AccuWeather, which is really AccuWeather is pretty. It's I do like them, and then also I think you went to NC State.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm planning on going there, so that'll be
Hey, let's go Wolfpack.
yeah, Wolfpack. So yeah, so then so at the office when Helene first got designated, like even when it was like a potential tropical cyclone by the NHC, uh, was it was it always on your guys' eyes? Like, were you guys did it? Was it something that you guys were always monitoring, even when it was as a disturbance? And if not, when did it first get your attention?
Yeah, Helene caught our attention pretty early. The models that we use were actually fairly consistent. It's one of the most consistent, run to run model trends that I have seen in my short career, in regards to, a significant storm or just an event in general. So we had our eyes on it for a while. Even like a week out, we were like, it's been pretty consistent. Model showing it hitting, making landfall somewhere in the eastern Gulf. And usually that bodes the question of what impact will we see? Because usually when there's a tropical system making landfall kind of in the eastern half of the Gulf, we tend to, you know, worry about some kind of impacts, whether that be flooding, whether that be tornadoes. In this case, we had to worry about the wind too.
Yeah,
That's usually not the case. I mean, you'll have some wind. You may get tropical storm force gusts. But in the case of Helene, we had hurricane force gusts. So that was a whole new, aspect that we had to take into account with the system as it was basically barreling towards us, closer to the event, that we here in the Western Carolinas just aren't used to seeing.
yeah. And when did y'all notice that the potential for a catastrophic event was beginning to occur? When did y'all begin to notice that?
So Helene made landfall, that Friday on September 27th, that morning. And really, it was that Tuesday is when we really noticed things were kind of going downhill very fast.
Right.
We had the predecessor event that set up over our area, and between Tuesday and Thursday of the event, I mean, there were areas in the mountains that had picked up 1 to 2 feet of rain.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember seeing that.
So, especially seeing that and knowing, what Helene could potentially do, I think it was Tuesday we started messaging out like to our partners and on social media the threat for catastrophic and life-threatening floods.
Yeah, because remember seeing the public information statement that you made, because I saw your initials at the bottom of it.
Mhm.
What was it like making that statement and also tweeting it out? What was it? What was your thought process behind it?
You know, I of course never want to send something like that out. It's one of those forecasts you actually want to get wrong,
Right.
but we saw the severity of things that were happening. We already had multiple flash flood warnings out for the mountains. Prior to the storm, everything was rising as far as like, main stem rivers and streams and creeks, and just all the different river basins, especially in western North Carolina and the mountains. And I think one thing that really got to me is our hydrologist. Our hydrologist did a fantastic job on
Yeah,
this.
absolutely.
And when he started comparing it to the floods of 1916, of
Mm,
course, none of us remember that. We can only read about it and see some of the photographs that are there.
right.
But, and not even just like recent memory, just like in our lifetime and, way before then, nobody has even mentioned, the floods of 1916 and have a storm even come remotely close to comparing it to that. And so whenever our hydrologist started to compare the floods to something that we've never seen before, that's when I took the initiative to write that special, that public service statement.
Yep.
Um, so I took the initiative. Of course, I had others look at it before I actually sent it out, especially, management. I didn't want management to not know what was coming out in regards to when I started typing it. And one of the managers actually suggested, because at first I was just going to do it for social media,
Yeah.
because, I'm the social media focal point there. So I was just wanting to try and get some kind of message out there that's going to say, hey, this is something like we've never seen before. If you haven't prepared, you need to, evacuate, take all orders from local emergency management. We've actually gotten a lot of good feedback, I would say, from like the messaging that we were providing, because
Absolutely. Yeah.
emergency managers were telling us how they were going door to door telling people to evacuate, that were in those flood prone areas. And so I think, yeah, just going back to our hydrologist comparing the floods to 1916 and the lights of something we've never seen before really helped initiate that. And of course, with the help of my colleagues, we got that message out to the people. I'm hoping that it helped. We were already sending out, very strong wording and products and messaging and social media posts about, the potential impacts to come. And then as far as getting it into a public, service statement, my manager actually was talking to me about how one of the National Weather Service employees back when Hurricane Katrina hit at the New Orleans office put out a statement with similar wording. And he also mentioned the fact that, how the anniversary of Katrina every year, he always did a TV interview. I didn't do it, for that, but kind of just put things into perspective that, hey, this is our Katrina.
Yeah.
So putting that out, it was honestly, it took me a while to really like gather exactly what I typed and
Yeah.
having to reread it a couple times to be like, this was actually real.
Yeah. For one, like, as for me, I record anything that gets issued as like sort of something I can look back on. I recorded a lot of what happened during Helene, and I remember like seeing. I remember it going over IMBot and seeing and just hearing the actual message itself, and I'm like, this is not real. I could not, like, I literally could not
Yeah.
just accept the fact that this may be like, this has potential to be possibly the worst thing I've ever tracked. And in my opinion, I, I say it is.
Yeah.
But so going back, because you did mention the possibility of like hurricane force winds, which we did have. Now, when it comes to tropical products, what's the process like with that? I know the NHC does issue them, but at the same time, what's the process like at the office?
So, we're going through the data that we get with each model run, and we're kind of comparing and contrasting and kind of seeing what Hurricane Center thinks. We coordinate with the Hurricane Center when it comes to, really anything tropical that's, going to threaten our area. And I would say that kind of going back to when we issued those tropical storm, we actually issued a tropical storm watch, which I think is the only the second time ever our office has done that.
I'd
Um,
say so, yeah. I believe
yeah, I
so.
can't remember. Well, I think there was one more storm we did it for him. I can't entirely remember, but in the process of that, we coordinate with our neighboring offices. So we have Atlanta, Columbia, Morristown, Tennessee, Roanoke, Virginia, and Raleigh. And I was actually the one that issued the tropical storm watch. And, you know, I was coordinating with those offices, and we kind of came to a conclusion of what we saw and where we thought the best chance for tropical storm winds. It was more so for sustained winds, not necessarily wind gusts.
Right.
So we were pretty confident that there was going to be tropical storm, sustained winds. But as far as any kind of wind gusts exceeding tropical storm force into, hurricane category, that one was pretty hard to kind of pinpoint and whether or
Yeah,
not we were going to do that. We actually had talks of putting out a hurricane watch to go along with the tropical storm warning.
that would have been interesting.
But exactly, and that was part of the reason why we didn't do it was because people on the coast maybe they're used to having a hurricane watch and a tropical storm warning out. People this far inland are not. I felt like that was going to confuse the messaging.
It would have confused
Um,
me because I'm just like
yeah,
I do remember like hurricane warnings being up very far inland into Georgia, up almost up into Atlanta, but I didn't like here. I mean, it would have made sense. I mean, for the higher terrain, but at the same time, it's just like anywhere because it's for the entire county. You can't really like issue it for the entire county and just have to have it accounted for just for the higher terrain.
yeah. So we had internal discussions about issuing a hurricane warning, but it was either we stick with tropical storm warnings or we go straight to hurricane warnings because at the point when we were discussing that, Helene was maybe 24 to 36 hours out.
Yeah,
So even then I felt like it was a little bit too late to even think of going watch when we have the dire messaging that we're putting out in regards to this storm already.
right. Now, let's talk the meteorological aspect of the entire event.
Mhm.
Um what made Helene such a unique case compared to the precedents that were given? Like they also mentioned, you mentioned Francis, Ivan, Fred, and also the 1916 like flood. But what made Helene such a unique event when it comes to the flooding and what caused everything?
Yeah, so Helene, we talked about the predecessor event. Basically, I guess in a more simpler form of discussing it, you had a cold front that stalled to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, and you just drove in a lot of, you know, really warm and moist air. And the wind flow was actually favorable for an upslope component. So this upslope component just kept, showers and heavy rainfall just kind of ongoing, starting that Tuesday and going into Wednesday and even Thursday. And there really wasn't, that much of a break in between. So you're getting areas that are just kind of heavily induced with like really high rainfall. So, like I said, you had spots in the mountains before Helene even got here that had a 1 to 2 feet of rain, and on top of that, Helene just came barreling down, or I say up to us. From a synoptical standpoint, you had a closed upper low kind of centered. I think it was relatively close to like eastern Tennessee, was where the center of it was. And so at the same time, you had a pretty strong Bermuda high off the southeast coast. And so the actual gradient between the two was very tight. And so that just creates a really fast steering flow for the system. And it tapped into it, as it made landfall. And so Helene makes landfall as a category, I think it was a 4 hurricane.
Yeah.
And, 18 hours later, it's in our area. So the frictional force from Helene just didn't have time to cause the storm, disrupt the storm and completely, disintegrate the actual eye wall associated with Helene. And so the eye wall still had convective elements to it that normally you would see on the coast.
Right.
And so since that eye wall stayed intact, you kept the wind field that was associated with it too.
Yeah.
So the actual storm motion itself was like 20 to 25 miles per hour. And, that's unheard of. And it could have been faster than that,
Yeah.
if we're being honest. And so you keep that going and you factor in all of the rain and the rises in the rivers, creeks, and streams out ahead of Helene. And then you have very saturated grounds. And so that's just going to loosen things up and allow, trees to fall down like dominoes essentially. And then one of the other aspects to it is that there were a lot of kind of like not necessarily tornadoes, which a lot of people want to say what happened, but it was a lot
No.
of kind of tornadic vortices type of stuff that was happening
Yeah.
inside the actual eye wall. And so not necessarily a tornado, but of course you have those very localized areas within the eye wall that's going to kind of whip around stronger winds to the surface, and cause those localized heavier wind gusts where you see, especially around here, you'll notice like there's some areas that seem like they got hit harder than others. And I think that kind of relates to that aspect of the eye wall, producing those type of vortices and just the overall convective elements with it as well. I personally have no experience with, seeing an eye wall intact that well this far inland.
Yeah.
And so it was a recipe for a disaster, and I don't want to call it the perfect storm, but it had all the ingredients to be one if you're going to have that much
I
devastation.
mean, I think like the day afterwards, I was talking to my friends about this. I'm like, this felt like the worst case scenario come to life, basically.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was worst case and then some.
Yep. And speaking of which, so when I looked at statistics for flash flood emergencies, right?
Hmm.
So the Greenville-Spartanburg office set the single day record for the most flash flood emergencies issued by one office in one day.
Yep, I
Um,
believe it.
so when was the decision made to begin issuing those flash flood emergencies, in particular ones for the lakes and the rivers, like the Taba River as well as Lake Lure? What was it like talking to like Duke Energy, and what was it like a request by Duke Energy? But like when was the decision made to issue the flash flood emergencies for those areas?
Yeah, so when we put out flash flood emergencies, we do it in coordination with the county emergency manager.
Yeah,
That's usually the first point of contact that we go to whenever we think that conditions are bad enough for a flash flood emergency. The first one that we issued actually was for at least county based. I'm not entirely sure as far as like individual
yeah, it was for
names.
Haywood, I'm pretty sure.
Haywood, yep. I actually took that phone call, and it was the county EM. And I mean, without hesitation, there wasn't any, hey, how you doing? What's up? What's going on there in the office? It was, hey, we need a flash flood emergency immediately. We have houses that are underwater. I mean, this is the middle of the night,
Yep.
and he's telling me that houses are underwater. There's all kinds of roadways that are flooded. There's ongoing swift water rescues, just everything coming together as far as what we had been forecasting in that moment. it was like, okay, this is real. It's time to, buckle up because Helene's not even here yet.
Yep.
Um, so we put out that first, flash flood emergency, and then from there, usually in most cases outside of Helene, it's usually kind of like us waiting to get a call from an emergency manager to issue one of those emergencies. Now, of course, if we think conditions are bad enough from a meteorological standpoint, we'll do the reaching out. But after getting that phone call from Haywood, we immediately started calling all the counties, basically in Western North Carolina and parts of the upstate, and asking them, what the conditions are like there. Would you like for us to go ahead and put out a flash flood emergency? And so that's why you kind of saw, like, throughout the night and into the early parts of the morning, where you'll start seeing individual counties start lighting up with a flash flood emergency, because we were making those phone calls, and it was kind of based on like where we thought the potential was, greatest as far as needing a flash flood emergency. So starting out with Haywood when they called us, and I'm sure that I talked to multiple EMs during that time, and others in the office were talking to, other county emergency managers. And I mean, I don't think we got denied once for putting out a flash flood emergency.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it was like, yeah, we were like, hey, we're thinking about issuing a flash flood emergency, and they're basically like, yeah, go ahead and do it. You need to
Yep.
do it now.
Because I think after that, after the Haywood one, the next one was for trying to remember, was it for the Swananoa River?
Hmm.
Yeah, that one. And because I had the whole timeline memorized for some reason, but it's just because I've tried, I've for like a couple months, I just basically been trying to replay the entire everything I recorded just to because it still didn't feel real because of just how everything panned out. But so going back to the Catawba River. So I think if you remember how like say like Mountain Island Lake had one, Lake James, and then
Hmm.
also Lookout Shoals Lake. What's the process like when it comes to for these dams? Do you call Duke Energy and they say what the lake level is, and then that's when the emergency gets issued, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we coordinate with Duke Energy when it comes to the dams. County emergency managers usually have some kind of, say in that as well, as far as, knowing the individual rivers that are in need of that kind of product. Um, Now, when we got in contact with Duke in regards to, the dams and just kind of looking at the forecasts of the different gauges that we have, thanks to, Duke Energy giving us that information and them telling us kind of what levels they are as far as high flow, and whether or not the dam has any, sort of threat to be damaged or even a complete failure. Thankfully, well, most of the dams didn't have like imminent failure issues. There were just a lot of high flows, and but they were concerning,
Yep.
of course. And so other parts of like us going into the process of issuing these flash flood emergencies for individual, rivers. It's kind of looking at the, aerial hydrographs that we have with the different stream gauges that are up. And I mean, a lot of them were beating records like it was nothing. It
Yep.
was, that it didn't even come close to the record. It surpassed the record and then probably broke it again. It
Yeah. It's
was that
yeah.
bad. Um,
Cause the I remember seeing the French Broad River at Fletcher that gauge because it's
mhm,
publicly available. I remember seeing it. It's at 30 feet. The original record was 20. And I
exactly.
remember looking at this. I'm just like, so I guess the record is just never gonna be touched again.
I mean, we hope not.
I hope not.
Yeah, yeah, we definitely hope it won't be on.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks in our office, they've been here longer than I've been alive. They've been at this office for 30 years, and all of them agree that this is by far the worst event that they've ever had to work through.
Yeah. And speaking of which, what was the mood? like at the office? What were the operations like? I remember talking. I remember asking this question at um, the Skywarn meeting like a couple months ago. I remember asking this question like, what was the mood at the office and how did y'all operate during this?
Honestly, th- we had a really good way of going about it as far as there was no panicking. Everybody was doing their jobs, everybody was contributing. We all knew the seriousness of the event, and we worked together as a team.
Yeah,
It was totally a team effort. Everybody played a role in it, and everybody's was significant. Um, I think, as a meteorologist, especially one in the National Weather Service, there's always that big one that you continuously prepare for. And what do you know? It was our turn.
yep,
And, so there was no panicking. And I don't want to say that we were just, grinding it out and just doing such a great job. I mean, of course, there's a human element to it. You get tired, you get mentally drained. You have those moments where it stresses you out. And but I think we were all checking in on each other. We all made sure that we were good to go. If somebody needed a break, go ahead, take your break. um, and so we were watching out for each other. And you know as a staff and as a whole, we I don't honestly, there's not too many things I would change about the way that we handled operations. I thought we did a really good job. I mean, was it perfect? No, it's never going to be.
yeah,
But I think in the magnitude of this event and the way that we handled ourselves, it was honestly something special.
yeah,
And I know one of the comments that we heard from emergency managers is when we were doing our live webinars for them briefing on Helene. They had even mentioned, they could hear it in our voice, the seriousness of this event. And just hearing like us talk about it helped them, take action and warn others in their communities about what's to come.
yeah. I definitely thought y'all did a really good job, and I was really impressed by how it all went down. And whoever the hydrologist is, I send regards. 'Cause
Uh,
he's
he he
he's
worked around the clock, and I think out of like a 72-hour period, he probably slept like 3 hours.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was he was there was an MVP for operations. It was definitely our hydrologist.
So now that it's 5 months later, almost five
Mhm.
months later, um, what do you remember of the attitude of the communities affected by Helene? And what was there a sense of the community coming together in your opinion?
I think at first, no. If I'm being completely honest, if you're talking about the communities that impacted, I mean, obviously these people just lost everything.
Yeah,
They once had a house, they once had a car, they once had personal belongings and things that they held on to for a lifetime, and it was just completely gone and swept away. So it's understandable that you know people felt the way that they did and wanted to blame somebody else. And I think I think that was only for a short period of time. I think once things started to settle, as far as like Helene's finally out of here. I think one of the things that really helped out was how dry it got after Helene.
absolutely.
I think that helped out a lot. I mean, I don't think we saw rain for like another 3 weeks after Helene.
Yeah,
But people were very vulnerable. They were very sensitive, which, like I said, I mean, I can't blame them at all.
yeah,
Um, But I do think as time went on, the community grew closer and closer together. People were working together to make sure that people had things that they needed to survive, had shelter. Of course, you hear all these different types of stories and conspiracies about, you know, people not having, adequate shelter,
Yeah.
which I know in some aspects it was, but talking to emergency managers, they definitely reassured us that, you know, most people had at least some option of shelter. And sometimes people just don't want to take them up on that offer.
Hmm.
So it's not just on, you know, the first responders, such as, your emergency management trying to help these folks. I mean, some people just want to do it their own way. And I know, for example, you had people in Chimney Rock, they didn't have but a couple of deaths, but the deaths they had were people that were told to evacuate and they chose not to.
Yep.
So, I mean, in that regard, there's only so much that they can do. There's only so much that we can do to message it. And, it's like, in a sense, it's like, how do you message for something that none of us have ever seen before when it exceeds really all wording that you could provide?
Yeah. That feeling is really bad. It's terrible to have that feeling of just
Yeah,
it happening and there's nothing really you can do about it. It's one of the worst feelings you have as a meteorologist. Uh,
that is for sure. And we felt that.
yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Chimney Rock, I visited Lake Lure, I think this past weekend on our way back from Atlanta. And I just remember visited both Asheville and Lake Lure, and I remember driving by the River Arts District. Uh, from what I've been told, they've cleaned up so much, and I could definitely see that they've cleaned up so much. But also at the same time, there's so much still to clean up. And
Hmm.
same thing with Lake Lure. Lake Lure, the river walk's gone, and it's unfortunate because it's such a
Yep.
such a historic, just historic bridge. And then we couldn't eat with the Chimney Rock itself is still closed to only it's only open to local traffic, residents, and basically that's anybody that is a resident, but everybody else they can't enter it. Which, to be fair, that's understandable because
Yep.
you don't wanna just have anybody just walk in and ruin it for one thing, and it's just
Exactly.
sad because I Chimney Rock is just such a beautiful place, and it's unfortunate to see like Batcave. I had family in Bat, I not family like family friends in Batcave, then I also had family friends in Maggie Valley, and then also in West Jefferson. It's just such a terrible storm, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, and before we end things off, do you have any more comments? Anything you'd like to add?
Um, I my heart goes out to the people in Western North Carolina. It's devastating, but I've been up there a few times and you do get that sense of community, which is something that they desperately need.
Yep,
And I know that they still need help. So if
absolutely.
there's people that are willing to still go up there and help, or just even even funds, I mean, you can never go wrong with giving funds if you have the means to do so. I think, any help up there is still appreciated, and we're talking about this 5 months later.
Yep.
So my heart still goes out to them. They're always in my thoughts and prayers, and you know, I I hope that we never see anything like this again.
Yeah, I hope not.
I think I think too, though, is that if there is one, I don't even want to say positive thing, but one, I guess, kind of outlook on it is that, when we start, if we have a scenario like this again and we make the comparison that this could be like Helene, I think people are going to heed those warnings a lot better,
Absolutely.
and take them a lot more seriously, which, you know, I understand that we're meteorologists. We get blamed for a lot of things.
Yep.
You got to have thick skin to be in this field. But I think when we go back and we're like, hey, we're comparing, this has the makings to be something similar to Helene. I think the response to it, especially from the general public, is going to be a lot more. There's going to be a lot more of a sense of urgency,
Yeah,
which, you know, I hope it, like I said, hope it never comes to that. But I think if that's one outlook that we can almost guarantee, it's going to be that.
absolutely. Well, it was great talking to you. Thank you for your insight.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
so I'll see you next week.
All right, that sounds good. Just send me the link to this when you can.
Yep, I will.
All righty,
All right,
talk after later.
all right. See you.